Well, let's go traveling with Paul in the Achaean ministry now. And that will take us to Athens and to Corinth. Here's the map. This is really the continuation of the second missionary journey, which of course began in Antioch. Last week we looked at Paul traveling across Anatolia, revisiting places, but presenting the good news of the fact they don't have to go under the law, and going through Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and up to Troas. At Troas, he receives his Macedonian call and crosses the water to Europe. And we have the first preaching of the gospel in Europe. He went to Neapolis, you see that on the map, Amphipolis down to Apollonia, and he went to Philippi first, then Philippi, then Apollonia, and into Thessalonica, and to Berea. That's where we ended last week. So we're going to continue at that point, and you see how Paul is going to go south. He will be leaving the Ignatian Way, the highway that goes from Byzantium to Rome, and he'll be going south to Athens. You see where that is. Now, this whole area, the south part of Greece, you can see in the white, is Achaia, and including the Peloponnese, which is the southern part where Corinth is. All of that was incorporated by the Romans into the province of Achaia. So I'm calling this the Achaean ministry. So going to Luke's comment in Acts 17, those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens. And after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. Athens. This is one of the most famous cities, of course, in the world. During the time of what we call the Hellenic period, in the Greek world, the pure Greek world, before it was mixed with other civilizations, it produced the first and maybe the only true democracy. It was also the birthplace of drama, and we have the first theater in the world there, Theater of Dionysius. Athens did not begin philosophy, but it developed philosophy into its mature form. It was a leader in agriculture. It created an empire of 160 cities that it came to control. It dominated for a while the economic markets of Greece. The chief export items for sale would be olive oil, used in lamps and anointing the body and in cooking, and in pottery. And they also had an excellent military, both infantry and navy, particularly their navy. Most famous of all, not only among Greek buildings, but I think in the architecture of the world, would be the Parthenon, the temple to Athena. And by the way, I think most of you may know that the only full-scale replica of the Parthenon is in Nashville in Centennial Park. As a brief history of the Parthenon, it was a temple to honor Athena, who was the goddess of wisdom and of the city and of civilization and of war to protect the city. It originally was a temple that was on the Acropolis, destroyed by the Persians in the Persian War. Parts of that temple are still remaining today because they were used as a quick fill to rebuild the walls of the Acropolis. It was rebuilt under Pericles, the great general during the democracy, by the architects Inctinus and Callicrates. The sculptures were by Phidias. When looking at the Parthenon, even the replica in Nashville, it appears to be completely regular. In fact, there are no regular dimensions in the Parthenon. Everything is irregular. And that is accommodating the differences that the eye sees, right to left eye, which is called parallax. It's a very, very marvelous engineering scientific feat accomplished by the architects. The marble was imported from Mount Pentelicus. It was entirely marble. Most Greek temples were partially wood. Either their columns were wood and were then covered with a veneer of brick and then plaster. And maybe the ceiling was of wood, but the Parthenon is completely marble. After the advent of Christianity, it became a Christian church. It became later a mosque. It was blown up by the Turks in the 17th century. And today, of course, is a tourist attraction. Now, when Paul went to Athens, He went into, of course, the synagogues, but also he will go into the agora. Remember, he's by himself. He's waiting for Timothy and Silas. And his spirit was stirred as he encountered idolatry there. So let's go back to Luke's narrative at this point from Acts 17. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and of course he always did, synagogue first, and in the marketplace, the agora, every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, what does this babbler wish to say? That may literally be translated a seed picker, like a bird picking its seeds. Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting, for you're bringing some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. Now, this picture is in the Agora. I am there several years ago, pointing out one of these markers designating a monument to a god, to one of our companions in travel. And this young man who went with us in a trip, I think it's 1978, good friend of our older son, is pointing out the original stone, which may go back into the 7th century or 8th century BC, but that stone has an inscription on it, which you see above written out, saying, I am the boundary of the agora. So this stone marked the boundary where you would come into the agora. And here is a picture of it as it is today. The ruins of the buildings in the foreground, only the foundation stones are visible. These are the ruins of the government buildings that were in the center of the agora. Behind, you see a restored stoa. Stoa means porch. These buildings had this long open porch. We'll see a picture later. And people would gather there and have meetings and discuss. Athenians love to talk. Climate is good to be outside. And behind the porch are shops, and that's where they would shop. So there were also temples there. The agora was a center of government, the center of business, and a center of religion. Now, as far as the government is concerned, one of the primary buildings was the tholos. These are the ruins, the foundation of the tholos. That is where the council met. The council of the 500 under the democracy. They didn't all meet there at the same time. They divided up into groups of the year that would be a much smaller number than the total number of 500. But that is when they met there during a period of time called a prytany. That's a tenth of the year, actually. And it was a tenth, so it would be about 50 members there at the time. They were the legislators. They would make the laws. Now, the tholos means a beehive-shaped building. That's the Greek word for beehive. So it's shaped like a beehive. Of course, the building is gone now. There is a tholos that remains in the south part of Greece. And this is a very, very significant building as far as politics are concerned. But what about philosophy? Because Paul is going to encounter philosophers. He's going to encounter Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. As I said, Athens did not start philosophy. We have a group of philosophers known as the pre-Socratic philosophers. It all started with Thales of Miletus. Of course, Miletus is in Anatolia. But it reached its mature development in Athens with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the philosophers who followed him. Socrates was born in 469, died in 399, put to death by the democratic government for corrupting the youth. The Delphic oracle once said, no one in the world is wiser than Socrates. And he said, wait a minute, I know I'm not wise. And if I'm not wise and I'm the wisest, nobody else is. So he set about to prove popular notions that people maintained inconsistent. He took no fee. He even challenged the Athenian democracy, which made him very unpopular with the masses, who were very democratic and supported that form of government. He also haunted the marketplaces, just hang around to talk with anybody with whom he can speak, and particularly the gymnasium. There he would encounter the young men whom he was accused of corrupting by his ideas, and his pupils who followed him became some very famous people, and sometimes very notorious people, like Alcibiades. Also, Plato was his pupil, Xenophon, the historian, Euclides, Aristippus. Now, he never left Athens except to fight in the Peloponnesian War at the Battle of Delium, and he fought courageously. Now, Plato was born in 427, died in 347. We know of his life from Thucydides, who was an excellent scientific historian, particularly telling us about the Peloponnesian War, and Xenophon, who was also an historian. They give us the details of Plato's life. But it is from Plato that we learn about Socrates, because Socrates didn't write anything. But Plato was there listening to Socrates, his beloved teacher, and he wrote down his teachings in dialogues. And so we have Socrates teaching in Plato. He traveled after Socrates was put to death and returned to Athens in 388, about 10 years later, and founded the academy, his school. And he taught in the academy for the next 40 years, received no money for his teaching. And by the way, the academy and the Lyceum of Aristotle were the only two institutions to survive the ancient world. All transitioned into Christian institutions except these two schools. They remained until 529. So these two schools lasted for about 800 years. Then Aristotle, 384 to 322, who was a pupil of Plato. Plato, pupil of Socrates, Aristotle, a pupil of Plato. And he founded, as I said a moment ago, his own school at Athens called the Lyceum. Now, he is going to take the opposite position of his teacher, whereas Plato is going to assume that reality lay in ideas, or he called forms. Matter, he said, changes, and that which is unchanging, the idea or the form, is what is real. For instance, the concept or the idea of a chair, that is the real thing, and physical chairs are a manifestation of that. Aristotle turned it around the other way. He assumed the reality of matter, which Plato denied. And he simply studied these particular things that were material things to look for common similarities, and reasoned, once he formed the generalities, the common similarities of certain particulars, that would be a generality. And then he would investigate generalities and form a further generality higher than that incorporated similarities there, until he continued to build upward in these generalities until he reached the generality that encompassed everything else, which he called God. And he thought that everything was in a state of becoming. Therefore, everything had a potential. His mind covered all kinds of disciplines. Plato was primarily concerned with philosophy itself and with discovering the best possible ruler. Now, this picture illustrates not only Plato and Aristotle, but their thought as well. This is done by Raphael da Santo. This is his masterpiece. He was a painter of the Renaissance, and it's called the School of Athens. You will see Plato, the older man, on the left. Notice that Plato has his finger pointing upward toward God. Of course, Plato believed in God. He believed that everything came from God. And he is pointing to the fact of these great universals, these forms, these ideas which came from God. On the other hand, his pupil on the right, Aristotle, has his palm pointed downward toward the particulars, toward the material things. So there you have the illustration of their concepts in this painting. Now, Paul and Platonism. Some people say Paul had many Platonic ideas in the Bible. St. Augustine, for instance, claimed that Plato, among all philosophers, was closest to the truth. Now, Augustine said, you cannot come to God totally by reason, but there are some things you can discover by reason. And he claimed that Plato discovered things that were truth, whereas St. Augustine would, of course, believe that Paul taught by revelation, he taught by the inspiration of the Spirit. But there are some interesting similarities between Paul and Plato. For instance, Paul would have agreed with Plato that reality lay in the realm of the unseen. For instance, 2 Corinthians 4:18, Paul wrote, we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient. Very thing that Plato would say, they go away. And he says things that go away cannot be really the eternal things. The things that are unseen, he said, Paul taught, the things that are unseen are eternal. And Paul would have agreed with Plato in that everything comes from God. Romans 11:36, for from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. No, I do not believe Paul was a Platonist, but I believe there is agreement, substantial agreement between the philosophy of Plato and that which Paul taught. Now, having said that, other Christian theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas and many, many others have favored Aristotle and have taken the Aristotelian approach rather than the Platonic approach. Now, Hellenistic philosophy, that's philosophy following Plato and Aristotle. And what happened to make it different? Well, after the rise of Macedon, which we talked about last week with Philip II, and then Alexander the Great, and the expansion of the Greek culture into many other civilizations and cultures like Persia and like India and like Mesopotamia. Once that happened, and you have this great central government, this kingdom, you have the fall of the independent city-state no longer exists. It's controlled by this centralized government. And that means Aristotle, which were concerning the city and how you live in the city and relate to a city and find the good life in that city, that no longer is relevant at all. So the philosophy following the Hellenic philosophy of Plato and Aristotle is going to be what we call Hellenistic philosophy, concerned not with the city, but with the individual, and how the individual can find pleasure, and how the individual can find meaning in this great cosmopolitan world that existed. And by the way, I think the Hellenistic world is probably the most similar to our world today in many respects. And the two leading Athenian philosophers from the Hellenistic period would be Zeno, 336 to 264, the founder of Stoicism, and Epicurus, 342 to 270, the founder of Epicureanism. And guess what? It was Stoic and Epicurean philosophers who encountered the Apostle Paul in the Agora and invited him to come to the Areopagus and to share his thoughts. Now we connect it all together. Paul met with Zeno's philosophers, Stoicism philosophers, and Epicurean philosophers. Now you see Zeno on the left, you see Epicurus on the right. And here's the porch we saw. We saw it from the other side of the Agora, but looking down the corridor here, you see this open area where people would meet. Zeno came to the Stoa, not necessarily to this Stoa. There were several in the Agora, may have been, and he met with his pupils there. So the followers of Zeno were called Stoics because they met on the porch. This philosophy had religious overtones to it. It is Hellenistic. It stressed personal pleasure and the avoidance of pain, which you want to do. But how do you do it? By submitting to your fate, to duty. The Stoics were fatalists. They were determinists. They believed everything is determined. They do not believe in a purpose such as God, the eternal purpose, but they do believe that everything is going to happen according to fate, or que sera, sera. What will be, will be. And of course, as I said before, the Greek word from stoa gave the meaning to these philosophers, the porch where they met. It was very popular with Roman soldiers because they, of course, emphasized discipline and doing your duty. Now, Epicureanism, they were very different. They were similar in the fact that they did believe in pleasure and avoiding pain. But the means by which you avoid pain and have pleasure to the Epicureans was simply to withdraw from any situation that would cause pain. And to Epicurus, the best thing to do is just get away from the city, get away from civilization, get away from people, and go out and grow vegetables in your garden. They believed the thing that most causes fear is religion. Epicurus was an atheist. His followers were atheistic because they did not want to be involved in religion and suffer pain by worrying about the gods. Now, with that in mind, let's go with Paul to the Areopagus, once the center of government, that hill that we saw earlier, but then an intellectual society. Now, this is an interesting map. Take a few moments to look at this. You see the dark line would be the old wall around Athens, ancient wall that would have been there at the time of Paul. If you look to the right, you see it in the bottom right, you see the temple of Zeus that has been partially restored. It was actually built with the Romans. Now, the Theater of Dionysius, as you move to the left now, the Theater of Dionysius was the first theater in the world. It was built at the foot of the Acropolis. The word Odeon there, that was a Roman theater. The Acropolis then is next, the high city where the Parthenon is located. And then if you come further to the left, you see the Areopagus, the hill of Ares. And then going up from there, you see the Agora. In the Agora, the temple of Hephaestus. I mentioned that there were temples in the Agora as well. Now, if you can drop down to the left, you'll see the Pnyx. That is a hill where the ecclesia, or the assembly, met, where all Athenian citizens could go. And finally, it would take you up to the top left, and you see the Keramakos at the Diplon Gate. The Keramakos was the ancient cemetery, a very interesting place to go because many of the ancient Athenians are buried there, or there are monuments to them there. Now, this is the picture of the Areopagus. We're looking down from the Acropolis. You see the hill, and you see people on it. That is where, or near to there, and I think it was actually on that hill, that the council met. Well, what are we talking about? Council. The Athenian government in the 7th century BC, long before the time of Paul, 600 years before the time of Paul, they did have a king first, dealing with particularly religious matters. That was his power was particularly religious, and they were religious people. He served as the president of the Council of the Areopagus, which was made up of ex-kings and polemarchs, who were generals, and archons, who were political officials and other officials. The council was very powerful in the early days of Athens, but in 591, the council was stripped of much of its power under the Constitution of Solon. By this time, the middle class of the business class had arisen with power. They wanted more political power, and the Constitution of Solon gave them that power and took power from the Council of the Areopagus. Then another constitution put together in 508 by a man named Cleisthenes will bring about the democracy where people are ruling, entirely people, just individual people as powerful as anybody else. And the power went to the assembly of the people, the ecclesia, and the power of the Areopagus was completely removed except for hearing cases of homicide. And the ecclesia got all the power. Ecclesia, by the way, is the Greek word translated church in the New Testament. Now, with that in mind, and Paul being brought to the Areopagus by these philosophers who were Stoics and Epicureans, in order for Paul to have a chance to share with them the things that he'd been teaching in the Agora, here's his sermon, which is a masterpiece. And notice the strategy that he uses right at the beginning. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the bounds of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he's fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he's appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now, if we can back away to analyze the sermon, and you see his strategy, he began not by criticizing them and insulting them and belittling their beliefs, but rather by establishing a common base of understanding, which was religion. From the very beginning, Athenians were very religious. Their kings, as we saw, were devoted to religion. That was their responsibility. And there were temples everywhere. So the Athenians are religious. Paul is religious. We have something in common. He even quoted Epimenides of Crete, 7th century BC writer. In him we live and move and have our being. And he says, as I was going through the Agora, I found that you have an altar to an unknown God. And what is unknown to you, and they built that altar in case they left some God out and that God would be offended with them. This unknown God to them, Paul says, is the true God. I want to make the unknown God known to you. And he defined the true God. And you saw in his sermon, sovereignty, omnipotence, omnipresence, holiness, justice, purpose. And thus he graciously and yet effectively undermined their idolatry, undermined their false religion, and set forth the truth about God, which was unknown to them. And interesting, it is an example of taking the gospel to an entirely Gentile audience. Now, in the process, he would have effectively demolished the atheistic position of the Epicureans. On the other hand, he would have agreed with the Stoics on the sovereignty of God, but he would have disagreed with their determinism by showing that God had an operative purpose in what he does in ordaining all things. Now, there were results. Some people say it was a failure. Well, let's see. Luke says, now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. Now, they did stumble on the resurrection because that was never taught by any of the philosophers. Even Plato wondered about what the afterlife really was. They had some vague belief in it. So that's one reason they want to hear more about this resurrection. And interesting that among those converted, named here by Luke, was a man named Dionysius. He was a member of the Council of the Areopagus. That would mean that he was a high-ranking Athenian, probably a noble, or else in some way associated with the government. That is a significant conversion. And also a lady named Damaris. We don't know anything about her. I suspect, given what Luke talks about with other women being converted, that she probably was a prominent woman in Athens. Acts 18:1, Luke says, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. When I made my first trip to Europe, I took along a young man who was from our church. He was a song leader, 20 years old at the time. We had an extra space for a counselor, and so we had a free trip to Europe for 5 weeks. if he would serve as a counselor for, I think, seventh grader. Did a good job. But Bill also always had a Bible with him. And we left Athens. I realized what was going on. And I said, Bill, get out your Bible, look at Acts 18:1 and read it. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. I said, that's exactly what we are now doing. And back to our map, and you can see the route. It's not very far. See Athens located there at the tip of the mainland. And then there is this isthmus, this narrow body of land that joins to the south part of Greece, which is known as the Peloponnese. And you see Corinth at the top of that. And that is where Paul went. And of course, one comment that really sticks with us is what God said to Paul, I have many people in this city. And Paul was there the years 51 to 53. He was there a year and a half, as recorded by Luke in Acts 18:1 to 11. So let's pick it up in verse 2. And once he gets to Corinth, he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Stop for a moment and we'll comment on this. This is the first encounter of Paul with Priscilla and Aquila. Now, we know from the record that Luke gives us that they came from Pontus, which of course was in Anatolia. We looked at that last week. But they had gone to Rome. The Emperor Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. Claudius ruled between 41 and 54. And of course, at that time, Priscilla and Aquila left Rome and went to Corinth. Now, why did Claudius do this? Claudius was probably one of the most tolerant and reasonable of the Roman emperors, very intelligent, very good ruler. But the Jews, it seems, had caused all kinds of problems. We'll look at that just more in detail in just a moment. And because they were obstreperous and had caused uprisings in the city, Claudius drove them out. But after he died in 54 and Nero came to power, they returned. Normally, Jews enjoyed legal status in Rome, even privileges. It is said the Romans kind of bent over backwards to accommodate the Jews. For instance, they allowed them to offer temple coin in their offerings in the temple, rather than the Roman coin, which would be required of everybody else, everywhere else in the Roman Empire. And because the Romans objected to bringing their standards into Rome, which had eagles on them, and they felt that was idolatry, the Romans left their standards outside the city, Jerusalem, and did not bring them into Jerusalem. Now, Aquila and Priscilla may have had a part in the beginning of the church in Rome. We know that Christians met in their home later, but after they were driven out, they went to Corinth. That's where Paul encounters them. So let's go back to the account with Luke. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I'm with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people." And he stayed a year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. This is the main street in Corinth, the Lycaon Street. The synagogue was located to the right along this street, and I think, and the house of Titius Justus, of course, was next door to the synagogue. So I think much of Paul's activity may have centered here along this street. Just to show you the map of Corinth, you see the isthmus here, this narrow band of land that connects the mainland with the south part, the Peloponnese. And there's a bay on either side, the Bay of Corinth, the Bay of Cenchrea, and Paul would have crossed there. Now today, there's a canal that connects the two bays on either side across this narrow isthmus so that ships can come across. Before that, they had to actually pull the ships up on land. The Emperor Nero, who was ruling at the time of Paul, tried to dig a canal, and the earthworks are still there, but of course he did not succeed. It was not built until the 19th century when Nobel had invented dynamite. Now, just as a comment about Corinth for a moment, Corinthians and Athenians were always on opposite sides politically and culturally as well, and they were rivals economically. For instance, for a long time, the Athenians had dominated the pottery market with what they call black-figured vases. They would take red clay, which was found around Athens, and they would form the vase from the red clay, and then they would paint the design on with black glaze. And so the figures were in black. That was black figured vases. For a long time, they were very popular. The Athenians made a lot of money, but then the Corinthians designed their own vase to take the market away from Athens, which they did. The Corinthian vase, as you can see, is kind of a pear-shaped vase. It's on the left, and there are all kinds of interesting designs painted on the Corinthian vase. Well, not to be outdone, the Athenians then came back with what they call red-figured vases. This is very difficult to produce, and even today, buying some samples for souvenirs, replicas, what they do is to take the red clay and paint the background on in black, leaving the unpainted portion in red. So it's called red-figured vases, and they took the market back having done that. The Corinthians also came up with a capital, which is formed to simulate acanthus leaves. There are three forms of Greek capitals: the Doric, Ionic, and the Corinthian. This is the Corinthian, which became very popular with Romans. And also at Corinth, there were games held. We're familiar with the Olympic Games, which we have restored in modern times. The Olympic Games were at Olympia, but also there were the Isthmian Games, Isthmius at Corinth, and here's the stadium, the real stadium. This is exactly where the people sat to watch the races. The Olympian Games are at Delphi, and then the Nerean Games at Argos, 4 of them. Now, remember what God said to Paul. Don't be discouraged. I have many people in this city. Paul had reasons to be afraid and discouraged. He was a victim of viciousness that was increasing. He was the focus of implacable hatred. He had to leave Damascus, remember? Lowered over the wall in a basket. He had to leave Jerusalem. He had to leave Antioch in Pisidia and Iconium. These unbelieving Jews were following him everywhere, taunting him. He was stoned at Lystra. At Philippi, he was flogged and imprisoned, remember. And he was mocked in Athens by some of the members of the Council of the Areopagus. And now he was alone in Athens. He lacked funds when he arrived in Corinth. He was without money, and he was consistently rejected at the synagogues. And we saw a moment ago that unpleasant scene when he shook out his garments and he said, I'm going to go from now on to the Gentiles. And he received thus constant abuse from his own people. But of course, you saw how God had responded to tell him to be encouraged. He sent Timothy and Silas to him, and financially help was sent from the Macedonian Christians. He was blessed in his missionary activity. He stayed there for 1.5 years. God spoke to him in a vision that was very reminiscent of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, or Matthew 28, I'll be with you always to the end of the world. And of course, God's encouraging comment, I have many people in this city, people who are elect people who need to and must hear and will hear the gospel. Now, here are some other reasons for Paul to be encouraged. There were people who came during this year and a half to work with him. He mentions, for instance, in Romans 16, Timothy, my fellow worker. He mentions Lucius and Jason and Sosipater. He mentions Tertius, or actually Tertius comments because he was the scribe who actually wrote the letter as Paul dictated it in Romans 16:22. And he mentions also Gaius, host to me. Gaius looked after him, and the whole church greeting them. Paul sending greetings from Corinth to Rome, and Erastus, the city treasurer. They converted the city treasurer, and he became closely associated with Paul, and Quartus. Now, interestingly enough, Erastus has been confirmed by archaeological discovery. An inscription was found which states, you see the Latin on the first two lines there, and the English translation of this inscription is, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid the pavement at his own expense. Now, aediles, they were an elective office, often were mayors, but usually were elected wealthy merchants, and they would, through their wealth, subsidize a city for a year, and they were given honors for doing that. They were also called the curiales. And having sent Timothy, or sent into Macedonia, two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, Acts 19:22. He himself stayed in Asia for a while, and Erastus is mentioned again in 2 Timothy 4:20. Erastus remained at Corinth, and I left Trophimus, who was ill, at Miletus. This gentleman in the picture, known to me, we used to be associated many years ago in ministry. It's Farrell Jenkins, his name. He took groups to Europe for many years, and my sister went with him once. He's pointing to this inscription, which mentions Erastus. And further, Paul's associates in Corinth, Sosthenes, and Paul says, an apostle of Christ Jesus for the will of God, and Timothy, concerning our brother Apollos. I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, and I baptized the household of Stephanas. And he says, I rejoice at the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaeus, and again, the household of Stephanas. So these are people who came to work with Paul, and of course, that gives him great encouragement. And then he sent greetings to Corinth when he was in Ephesus. He mentions Timothy, he mentions Aquila and Priscilla. Now, the location of the synagogue has been identified and marked here with this marker. And that's along that street that you saw. This sign was actually the sign that was found. And it is now here on display at a museum in Corinth that displays the antiquities of Corinth. And this is a close-up of it. You can see, if you look at the Greek, it's going to say Hebrew. This is the entrance to the Hebrew synagogue. And again, here is the main street in Corinth. So let's go back to Luke's narrative now. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio, proconsul, said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have had reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names of your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. Well, who is this Gallio? Turns out to be a very famous person. You saw he's a proconsul. I mentioned before the proconsul was actually the highest office one could attain under the Roman Republican Constitution. That is, he had served as a consul before he went out as a governor. And now he's a governor. He was born Lucius Annaeus Novatus in 3 BC. He was adopted by the Roman rhetor. These are scholars who normally were orators, and they spoke and they also taught. Lucius Junius Gallio. His younger brother was the famous Lucius Annaeus Seneca, who was a playwright, who was a Stoic philosopher, who was a statesman, who was a satirist, who was a teacher of Nero and a writer of essays. Obviously one of the most prominent people in Rome. And Seneca said of his brother, Gallio, the very one mentioned here by Luke, no one of mortals is so pleasant to one person as he is to all. Now, the third brother was Marcus Annius Mela, and all three of these brothers were forced to commit suicide by Nero. An inscription from Claudius, the emperor, was found in 1909 near Delphi. Lucius Junius Gallio, my friend and proconsul of Achaia in the 12th tribunican year of Claudius in the year 52. And we know Gallio's term of office then would have been May 152 to May 153, and that will pinpoint exactly when Paul was in Corinth. Now, he had just come from Rome. That's significant. I mentioned a moment ago, we'll see why why Gallio was unwilling to listen to the Jews and their complaints against Paul. And here's what he said, Gallio speaking. If it were a matter of wrongdoing, and wrongdoing, and you see the Greek there, adigma, means some injury inflicted on the complainant. Well, these Jews had no injuries, of course. Or he says a vicious crime, O Jews, vicious crime, erutma poneron, means wicked rascality or slick villainy that was perpetrated in a criminal way. Well, of course, that's not true of Paul. Or questions about words, and by that he meant logu, Jewish doctrine. Question about names, onomaton, that is contention about Jewish authorities. Questions about your own law, omutu kathumas, the Jewish Torah. In other words, these are quibbles about Jewish things they argue with each other about. It was this quibbling over these matters that caused Claudius to expel the Jews from Rome. And literally, what you see at the last here of these comments, the literal translation is, a judge, I, of these things, know. Now, Paul was brought before the Bema, and the Bema, of course, every Greek city is the place where the judge is going to sit on a platform elevated. That's where Gallio will be. And Paul will be standing down below. He's the accused, will be there. And you see as well some of our group, I think you recognize the middle one, at the Bema in Corinth. Now from there, Paul is going to go to Ephesus, and that's our topic for next week.